The Falcons can maximize Kyle Pitts this season if they can get more out of him with play action and in the red zone.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Gametime today. What time is it? It's game time. So if you do not know me, I am your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this podcast, where I've been podcasting specifically on Locked On Falcons for almost 9 years, and I appreciate each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day, and all you got to do to become an everyday or subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, after we spent yesterday praising Zac Robinson like good little patriots, today we're going to be good insurrectionists and tear Zac Robinson down and talk all about Kyle Pitts and his usage in this offense, and talk about the ways that Kyle Pitts also needs to be improved. But, you know, this stems from a conversation we had a little less than 2 weeks ago with Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta. And I basically asked him, how much you think Kyle Pitts' issues are on the coaching staff? How much you think is on Kyle Pitts? Jarvis said 70% on Pitts, 30% on the coaching staff. I said 60% on the coaches, 40% on Kyle Pitts. We can debate that all day, but basically I'm going to present you today why I think my assessment is the correct assessment. No offense, Jarvis. And, you know, we'll talk about where I think the coaching needs to get better. Play action passing. If you've been, you know, paying any attention to this podcast for the last 6 months, you could probably guess that. But we'll talk later about where Pitts can improve, particularly in the red zone, later in today's episode. But let's back up this truck and run over Zac Robinson, throw him under the bus, as they say. And I know you guys think I'm too hard on Zac Robinson, but, you know, my excuse is we spent the better part of the 8+ years on this podcast talking about play calling, whether it was Kyle Shanahan, Sark, Dirk Cutter, Arthur Smith, and now Zac Robinson. This is not new here. And we've, you know, watched the ups and downs of the Falcons play calling, and, you know, a lot of those ups and downs have coincided with the team's success because of that. And it's not because I think Zac Robinson is a bad play caller. I just think there are significant areas that he needs to improve upon. And the biggest one to me is the play action passing game. And, you know, I saw this information in doing research when I was doing a breakdown for the Locked On Falcons Insiders when researching Liam Cohen's offense with the Bucs and looking at some things that Zac could steal from Liam Cohen to improve this Falcons offense. And if you want to check out that film breakdown, you can, of course, become a Locked On Falcons Insider by hitting that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons, 14-day free trial. So you can check it out for free if you enjoy it and want more of this content. We got another one coming later this week on the defense and some of the changes that we'll see with Jeff Ulbrich. You know, that's all there for you as a Locked On Falcons Insider. But, you know, basically you've heard me talk many times about how the Falcons were the only team that did not run a tight end screen last year, basically to indicate that the Falcons aren't like other teams, and the ways that the Falcons differ from other teams isn't because they're particularly innovative, but for lack of a better term, because they're stupid, right? I'm sorry to be that harsh, but they do some stupid stuff from time to time that other NFL teams aren't doing. And basically, you know, in doing this research, I learned that the Falcons don't really ask their tight ends to run routes on play action. They essentially are being kept in to block. And I have some stats to throw at you guys. And, you know, if you're checking this out on YouTube, you can see the graphics on your screen. I'll do my best for the audio listeners to subscribe it. Somehow I messed up this graphic with a big blue dot in the middle of it. I don't know how that got there. But anyway, basically what this graphic is supposed to say is on only about 6% of all the routes run by our tight ends come via play action passes, right? The Falcons are at the bottom of the NFL when it comes to the percentage of opportunities that they give to their tight ends via play action. The NFL average, right? The Falcons are 6%. The NFL average is 23%. across the league, right? And every other NFL team averages between 13 and 35%. And we'll get into the nitty gritty of exactly how the Falcons utilize Kyle Pitts and their tight ends later in the episode. But basically, the quick explanation is it is basically normal for other NFL teams to use their tight ends via the play action passing game in the passing game, and the Falcons use their tight ends about 1/4 of the time that every other NFL team is using them. And in terms of targets, only about 9% of our tight ends targets come via play action. The NFL averages about 29%. And basically every other NFL team's between 14 and 42%. And so that basically means on average, our tight ends are getting about a third of the targets off of play action that a tight end would get in a normal NFL offense. And Pitts suffers the most via this because when you compare him to the other top tight ends in the NFL, only about 3% of Kyle Pitts' routes came via play action, only about 5% of his targets. And I compare that to the other top 32 tight ends in the NFL based off of yards last year. And that group averaged about 18% of their routes came via play action, 24% of their targets came via play action. So basically your average starting NFL tight end is getting about 5 to 6 more opportunities to make plays via play action than Kyle Pitts is in the Falcons offense. And if you just focus on the top 6 tight ends last year in terms of receiving yards, Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, George Kittle, Jonnu Smith, Travis Kelce, and Sam Laporta. 5 of those guys wound up making the Pro Bowl. Sam Laporta was the first alternate for the NFC Pro Bowl squad. So basically the Pro Bowl caliber tight ends last year, about 21% of their routes came via play action, which is up from the NFL average of 18%, and 28% of their targets came via play action, which is up from the NFL average of about 24%. So basically, to me, my interpretation of that is the best tight ends in the NFL are being weaponized via play action more so than your average NFL tight end. And so basically, to me, what these numbers are showing me is that the Falcons play action passing attack is fundamentally broken because it's not like any other teams. Like basically the tight end is not involved in the offense at all, particularly when the Falcons run play action passing. And basically a significant chunk of every other NFL offense, whether it's 15% or whether it's 40%, utilizes their tight end via play action, with the Falcons being the one exception. And basically Zac Robinson sees the tight end's primary function in play action is as a blocker. And of course, anytime we talk about Zac Robinson and his play action passing attack, the inevitable excuse comes up. Well, Kirk Cousins is limited mobility, and you can make the argument that the reason why our tight ends block way more than any other team's tight ends block is because they were worried about Kirk Cousins' mobility. We'll break that down and we'll look at sort of how Kyle Pitts compares to other tight ends in very similar offenses and how they're utilized as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So maybe you are, sitting here this summer wondering if you want to get to the ballpark and, you're worried about it being a last minute decision. Well, you don't have to worry about that because the easiest way to grab last minute tickets is with Gametime, and you don't get any of the stress. And with the money you save on those tickets, you can now splurge on food, drinks, and merch, or even invite more friends. Gametime makes it all possible by making buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop before you get to the first pitch, and they've got incredible last minute deals, panoramic seat views, and the lowest price guarantee that takes all the worrying out of buying. Gametime is also the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB, and if you're excited to see upcoming MLB action like the Atlanta Braves taking road trips to see the A's or the Cardinals, or you're just going to wait till they return home to face the Yankees after the All-Star break, Gametime is going to help take the guesswork out of buying tickets. So download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So, the excuse for Kyle Pitts' limited usage in play action could be Kirk Cousins, right? Kirk Cousins' limited mobility means that, you needed your tight end to stay in to protect and play a lot of these max protects with the Falcons consistently when they dialed up play action, the rare times they dialed up play action, right? Because they used play action the lowest amount of times in the NFL last year. The rare times that they used play action, they were predominantly running 2-man route concepts and often having 7 or 8 guys staying in to pass protect due to potentially their limited concern, due to the limitations and their concern about Kirk's mobility. And I think there's a kernel of truth to that, right? But, the thing that you always hear me say when it comes that, if it was only about Kirk's limited mobility, then why didn't things change when Michael Penix got in the game? Because things essentially did not change once Michael Penix got in the game, or if they did change, they only slightly changed, right? But, you can make the argument that it was too late in the season to really, completely change how they were going to, install brand new plays and whatnot in December, and you had to roll with what you got. But let's break down what Kyle Pitts and Charlie Warner were asked to do when the Falcons dialed up play action. Pitts was on the field for a total of 31 play action plays last year. 55% of the time he stayed in to block. 32% of the time he chipped and then released and basically was a check down option. Only 6% of the time did Kyle Pitts was he asked to run a route beyond 5 yards off of those 31 play action plays. 3% of the time he ran a less than a 5-yard route without, involving a chip. And then 3% of the time he was asked to block on a screenplay. And again, the key is that only 6% of the time Kyle Pitts, who runs a 4.4, was asked to run a route beyond 5 yards. And that role wasn't unique to Kyle Pitts. Charlie Warner was basically used in a very similar way. 78% of the time he was asked to stay in the block. 14% he chipped in and released. 3% he ran a route beyond 5 yards. And 5% of the time he ran a route 5 yards or less. And so clearly the Falcons saw their tight ends primarily as pass protectors, basically offensive tackles. Kyle Pitts is basically being utilized the same way that the Falcons probably utilized Levine Toilolo back in the day, right? 70 combined between Warner and Pitts, their combined opportunities, 70% of the time they were blocking. Another 20% of the time they chipped and were basically check down options. And for the sake of comparison, I wanted to look at how the Falcons utilized their tight ends in comparison to two other tight ends, George Kittle last year with the 49ers and Tyler Higbee 2 years ago with the Rams in 2023. And the reason why I looked at Kittle, because Kittle was the most productive tight end in the NFL last year when off of play action, leading the league with over 400 yards receiving off of play action, averaging more than 6 yards per route run on those play action plays, according to Next Gen Stats, which was double the production, more than double actually, the production of the rest of the Pro Bowl tight ends combined on those routes runs off of play action. So clearly, Kyle Shanahan was utilizing Kyle Pitts and George Kittle at a high level. And I'm just curious, to break down exactly how did Kyle Pitts, I keep screwing that up. Kyle Shanahan utilize George Kittle to maximize his ability. And then looking at Tyler Higbee because of the Rams connection, right? And Tyler Higbee, we didn't use this past year because Tyler Higbee was hurt for most of the year, but he was mostly healthy the previous year. That was Zac Robinson's last year in LA. So he got to see it firsthand. All right. And, Higbee is primarily a blocker, right? That's his primary role with the Rams over the years. And you've heard me in the past basically talk about the way that the Falcons utilize Kyle Pitts is basically the Higbee role. And I just wanted to kind of see if that holds up to scrutiny. And so I know you're sitting there saying, well, Aaron, Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, is that a fair comparison? These are arguably the two best play callers in the NFL. No, it's not a fair comparison, but it is trying to illustrate, hey, the best play callers, why, and not to say this is the only reason why they're the best play callers in the NFL, but they also have the vision of, hey, let's get our tight ends that are at this stage in their career far less dynamic of playmakers than Kyle Pitts is involved in our passing game. And when you look at George Kittle, he ran a route beyond 5 yards 46% of the time. Remember, that was only 6% for Kyle Pitts, right? He ran a route less than 5 yards, about 16%. He chipped and released on about 18% of those plays. He blocked on only 15%. Again, Kyle Pitts was over 50%, only 15% for George Kittle. He was a screen target on 4%, and then he was blocking for another player on the screen on 1% of those plays. And you compare that to Tyler Higbee in 2023. He ran a 5 yard longer than a 5 yard route on 33% of his play action plays, 5 yards or less in terms of route on 14%, chipped and released on 36%, blocked on 7%, and was a screen target on 10%. And so the first thing we'll point out is the screens. As I've mentioned, I think previously on the pod, I talked about Tyler Higbee being one of the most utilized screen tight ends on screens in the NFL the last several years. And so again, no excuse for Zac Robinson given the offense that he's coming from with that Rams offense that loved their tight end screens. And he was basically like, nah, I'm not doing that. Okay. And then in both cases, roughly half the time, in both Kittle and Higbee's cases, they were asked to run routes on play action. 62% for George Kittle, 47% for Tyler Higbee. And if we count chips as basically expecting those guys to primarily block before being check down options, Kittle was only blocking about 33% versus Higbee's 43%. And again, Kyle Pitts was, basically 90% where he was blocking or whatever it was. What number did I say earlier? 87% for Kyle Pitts. So there you have it, right? And those guys are far better blockers than Kyle Pitts. And so basically, that's just illustrating that the best play callers in the NFL actually use their tight ends in the passing game. And so to me, this is kind of the nail in the coffin for why Zac Robinson's play action passing attack stunk last year, for lack of a better term. And you've heard me spend the last 6 months complaining about it. And, I'm not going to make any promises that I won't complain about it any further, but I don't plan on complaining about it. I plan on this kind of being the last straw, and then we'll just move forward and basically say, okay, we know it stunk last year. It's got to be better this year. We'll see how it gets better this year. I think one of the ways that it can get better is getting Kyle Pitts more involved in it. And that's, again, why I say 60% of the issues involved in Kyle Pitts and his lackluster performance is on the coaching staff. Because, again, I don't think it's just, George Kittle just shows up and is productive. It's, a lot of it is just he's very productive running vertical routes. He's very productive after the catch and whatnot. It's part of the way, it's the way that he is utilized in that 49ers offense. And, if Kyle Pitts is used like a normal tight end, he would have probably ran, instead of the 13 routes that he ran off of play action last year, he would have ran close to 80, 79 to be exact. And what's interesting is of the 13 routes that Kyle Pitts ran last year off of play action, only one of them came after the bye week. And that was kind of one of the changes that the Falcons made after the bye week. They just basically stopped putting Kyle Pitts on the field when they ran play action after the bye week, when they basically came to the conclusion, we're going to solve our play action. So their solution was like, stop using Kyle Pitts. And, you could have easily concluded, well, Aaron, as you said earlier, that's because, they just basically use that guy as a blocker, and why not just have Charlie Warner block if that's all that person is going to do? But what's funny about it is Charlie Warner, getting the bulk of those reps, ran 8 routes off of play action over those final 6 games, which is more per game on average, slightly more per game than what Kyle Pitts ran over the first 11 games of the season when he only ran 12 routes. Right. So it's, in fact, they actually did kind of increase the amount of involvement, by a very small percentage of the tight end in the passing game with Charlie Warner in the lineup. So it just is, again, just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So, if we get Kyle Pitts to run a normal amount of play action routes, and if he's just as productive as he was last year on yards per route run on those play action plays, he would have added about 91 yards last year, which would have bumped him from, I think, like 13th or 14th in tight end receiving yards to like 8th, right? So right behind those top 6 guys that were Pro Bowl caliber. And then Kyle Pitts' yards per route run, again, in large part due to the fact that he never was asked to run down the field, was very low. It was about half what the average was for the other top 32 tight ends in the NFL. And again, if he's just average compared to what those guys were able to do, and you add that to a normal amount of play action passing routes, then he would have jumped to 6th in the NFL. And so basically he would have had more production than Sam Laporta last year. And there's a good chance that he would have been a Pro Bowl alternate based off of that. And so to me, it's just, again, if you get Kyle Pitts involved in this offense, he should be more productive. That's a way that you can get more production. And again, I know every time I talk about getting Kyle Pitts more involved in the offense, I always have a handful of listeners being like, oh, well, we shouldn't feature Kyle Pitts. And it's like, no one's talking about featuring Kyle Pitts. We're just talking about treating him like a normal tight end, right? By getting him a normal amount of opportunities on play action plays, right? If the Falcons run a normal amount of play action passes, that would roughly correspond to about 150 play action plays this upcoming season. And if they ask Kyle Pitts to run a route, whether it's 5 yards or 15 yards, half the time, right, a normal amount, he would basically run 75 plays. So no one is sitting here saying we got to feature Kyle Pitts on 75 plays. You probably only have to feature him, air quotes, feature him on like 15 of those 75 plays, right? That's basically one per game. That's all we're asking for, right? The other 90% of the time you call play action, you can design the play for literally anybody else. Just 10% of the time, just throw Kyle Pitts a bone. That's all it is, right? And so again, that's why I say 60% of Kyle Pitts' disappointment this year to me is on coaching, right? Because the Falcons don't run their offense like a normal team does. I'm just saying, just be normal. But if 60% is on the coaching, that means there's 40% that's left on Kyle Pitts to step up. And we'll spend the rest of today's episode talking about where Kyle Pitts, in my opinion, needs to be a bigger factor, and that is in the red zone. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So like I said, right, even though we spent more than 60% of today's episode talking about the coaching staff, I think only 60% of it, again, just normal play action stuff. Just be normal, run a tight end screen every once in a while, just run a normal route, every once in a while, and that should increase Kyle Pitts' production to maximize whatever you can get. And, I hope it's clear that it's not just we're doing this for S's and G's. We're doing this because, as I said on a previous episode, it's harder to defend 4 guys than it is defend 3, right? And we know that we have the big 3 in Bijan Robinson, Drake London, and Darnell Mooney. If you make it 4, that's harder to defend. That's what defenses really struggle with, right? It's like, oh, we got to worry about 4 guys instead of 3 guys. Unfortunately, last year, they only ever really had to worry about 3 guys for most of the season because Kyle Pitts was an afterthought in the offense. But again, 60% of it is on how Kyle Pitts is used. The other 40%, I think, is on Kyle Pitts himself. And this is where the inconsistency with Kyle Pitts comes into the equation. And we're not going to give Kyle Pitts a pass on this one. And to me, that big area where Kyle Pitts needs to improve is via the red zone. And I did a breakdown looking at Kyle Pitts' film from 2020 for the last 3 years, going back and looking at the film. And then I had to go back and look at my notes because I did a breakdown of this at the end of the 2021 season, looking at it, and I had to kind of reinterpret it because I wasn't able to find film of those 2021 plays before. But basically doing a breakdown of, Kyle Pitts' red zone targets. And in 2024, Kyle Pitts caught or scored about 30% of his red zone targets. I would blame the quarterback, whether it's off-target throws or throwaways or whatever, for not connecting on 15% of those throws. And then it was wide receiver error, or in this case, Kyle Pitts error, I should say. Either he dropped the ball, he didn't win a contested catch situation, or as we saw a number of times last year, about 3 times watching the film, where Kyle Pitts didn't run the route that Kirk Cousins thought he was going to run. And again, whether you want to blame it on the quarterback or the receiver, but we're going to put it on the receiver. The receiver error was about 46% of the time for Kyle Pitts, and everything else, if you're doing the math, is basically a defender broke up a pass that wasn't catchable, right? And then you look at the combined red zone production for Kyle Pitts in 2022 and 2023, he caught or scored on 60%, so almost double the rate this past year. Quarterback error was about 20%, and receiver error with drops and contested throws was only about 10%. In 2021, his rookie year, he caught or scored about 28% of the time. There was quarterback error on about 36% and receiver error on about 36%. And so consulting those notes, the thing that we pointed out back in 2021, when you look at the high rate of quarterback error, it was because basically the Falcons just kept trying to lob throws to him. And, as you guys may recall, Matt Ryan was not the world's greatest fade and lob quarterback. And so a lot of those throws were uncatchable. And so those went into this as QB error on that particular play. But, we've seen Kyle Pitts be his most efficient in terms of catching and converting the majority of his red zone targets in both 2022 and 2023. The problem was he wasn't being targeted all that much in those 2 seasons, right? Only about 9% of the Falcons, all of their red zone pass attempts went in his direction in those 2 years combined. And for the sake of comparison, I looked back at previous Falcons tight ends and I looked at the combined red zone target rate of Hayden Hurst and Austin Hooper from 2017 to 2020, and that was about 17.5%. So almost double the rate of targets that Pitts got in 22 and 23. And then you look at Pitts' target rate in his rookie season, it was about 17%. And then this past year, Pitts' target rate was about 22%, which is very close to what Tony Gonzalez's target rate was for his 5 seasons in Atlanta, which was 24%. So, This past year, it wasn't a lack of opportunity for Kyle Pitts. He just needs to take better advantage of those opportunities when he gets those opportunities. And so to me, this is an area where I do think it is mostly on Kyle Pitts. As we go back and look at those graphics and we see all of those instances of receiver error, right, where like basically 6 out of the 13 times he was targeted in the red zone this past year, it was quote unquote on him. And, again, that's, even if you cut that number in half, right? Again, ideally you can eliminate all those plays, but, just cutting that number in half gives you 3 more scoring opportunities this past year. And again, that doesn't seem like a large number, but that does make a significant impact on Kyle Pitts as individual. And that certainly does make a significant impact on the team's red zone conversion rate as a whole. And again, we don't expect Kyle Pitts to be the featured weapon in the red zone, right? We know Drake London and Bijan Robinson are going to be the primary options when the Falcons get into the red zone, but Kyle Pitts needs to be a secondary threat. Like you look at Drake, right? In terms of his target rate, about 41% of the Falcons red zone targets went to Drake London last year. That's up from the 2 previous years combined when that number was 30%. You compare that to Julio Jones during his prime from 2011 to 2019 and exclude the 2013 season when he was mostly hurt. His red zone target rate was about 19%. Roddy White during his prime from 2007 to 2012 was about 26% of the target. So Drake London is much more of a featured weapon in the red zone than either Roddy or Julio were, comparatively. But again, Kyle Pitts, if he can be more of a secondary threat, again, getting 20-25% of those targets like he did last year and converting more of those, that would be huge for the Falcons. And so basically when I'm tallying up the amount of times across the 4 years with Kyle Pitts in the red zone, where he's essentially been the one that screwed up, whether we're looking at drops, a questionable route, or he didn't win a contested catch situation, unfortunately for the Atlanta Falcons and unfortunately for Kyle Pitts, that number is practically the same as the number of times where he has actually caught or scored on a red zone target, about 12 screw ups, right? Essentially to 14 catches and conversions. So, that makes up to me the bulk of the 40% where I think Kyle Pitts needs to improve upon. So it is not to sit here and blame all of Kyle Pitts' issues on Zac Robinson. Kyle Pitts needs to be more consistent in the red zone. And I think if he can do that and you get Zac Robinson, running a normal offense this upcoming season, right? I think you'll see Kyle Pitts get maximized this past year. Does that lead to, what does that wind up leading to? We'll see. Again, me, when it comes to, putting hopes in whether or not we're going to get those improvements from Zac and Kyle, me, I tend to be very skeptical. I set my expectations low. I basically say, well, if we get the same as what we got last year, then, it is what it is. But, that's going to lead to, in my humble opinion, spicy take, neither one of these guys being back in Atlanta in 2026. So we will see how that goes for the Falcons. I don't think Kyle Pitts is likely to return to Atlanta, even in the world where we're maximizing him. That's going to allow him to potentially cash out, and the Falcons will go out there and probably find a tight end that fits more what Zac Robinson is looking, which is a guy that can just chip and release, right? Chip and release. But we'll see on that front in 2026. So lots of room for growth in this area. We'll continue breaking down the various positions for the Falcons as we get geared up for training camp. We'll talk more about Zac Robinson and the ways that he can improve by diversifying the run game when we get to the offensive line, potentially as early as tomorrow. I know technically, as many of you are listening to this on Tuesday, July 8th, that is when the Netflix drop for the quarterback is dropping. I'm not going to, unless something crazy happens, I do plan on watching that. But I do want to give people time to watch it. Not everybody binges Netflix at the same rate as other people do. So that may be a topic of discussion as we get to Thursday and probably more likely to be Friday when we talk with Jarvis Davis on that front. But always welcome your feedback on these various topics. Am I too hard on Zac Robinson? Am I too hard on Kyle Pitts? Am I not hard enough on either one of these parties? Always provide your feedback. And again, if you want to get access to a film breakdown when we break down not only how the Bucs use the tight ends in contrast to the Falcons' utilization of Kyle Pitts, in addition to how the Bucs use 2 running backs in contrast to how the Falcons utilize their 2 running back sets. That film breakdown is available for the Locked On Falcons insiders as we speak. And again, you can join in the link in the description below. Later this week, we'll be doing a thorough breakdown of what are the expected changes for this Falcons defense under Jeff Ulbrich by looking at some film of the Jets defense. That should be available on Friday or Saturday later this week. So again, you can get access to that right now for free if you become a Locked On Falcons insider at the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month. We're going to be doing various film breakdowns throughout the summer, looking at preseason games, obviously when we get to August. And then, of course, if you're a Locked On Falcons insider, you'll get access to those extended all 22 reviews later this fall, where we'll be breaking down the film of every Falcons game, basically showing you the film of all the various things that I talk about on the podcast, on the audio side of the podcast. So if you're a visual learner as opposed to an audio learner, it's definitely worth your while to become a Locked On Falcons insider. And in addition to that, you also get precedent on any future mailbags that we do, priority when it comes to me answering your questions. So all of that's available as a Locked On Falcons insider. That's going to do it for us guys here on today's Locked On Falcons. Continue to make us your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. For your second listen, check out Locked On NFL Scouting, as well as the Locked On Hawks podcast with Kristaps Porzingis, officially an Atlanta Hawk as we speak. So get Brad Rowland's breakdown of that and all the big moves the Hawks have made over the last couple of weeks on Locked On Hawks. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.